We at the Harvard Kennedy School want to honor the life and the legacy of the late George P. Shultz, Secretary of State of the United States. He passed away at 100 in California just a couple of days ago. I came to know Secretary Shultz when I was a very young Foreign Service officer working in the State Department when he was Secretary of State. I traveled with him on a memorable trip to Asia, to 9 countries in the summer of 1988, his last year as Secretary of State. And I came to know him later in his life when I was a fellow at Stanford University, over lunches and dinners and conversations in his office. I admired him greatly. And there are 3 things that stand out to me about Secretary Shultz's life. First, what a career in public service. Captain in the Marine Corps, combat veteran of the Second World War in the Pacific, 4-time cabinet secretary, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Labor, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. He was only one of 2 people in the entire history of the United States to occupy 4 cabinet positions. And in his long career as an academic dean, as a labor negotiator, as a cabinet official for President Nixon, and certainly as President Reagan's Secretary of State, he distinguished himself in public service for his personal honesty and ethics, for his high standards, and for his success. Certainly, as we look at and try to explain the end of the Cold War, the peaceful end to this epic conflict between the communist world and the democratic world, George Shultz and his role in negotiations with the Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze is one of the key figures in helping to end the Cold War peacefully. It needn't have happened like that if the United States and Soviet Union had not recognized their common interests, had not resolved to work together, for instance, in the negotiation that Secretary Shultz led for the United States in the elimination of thousands of intermediate range nuclear weapons in the INF Treaty of 1987, signed by President Reagan and President Mikhail Gorbachev. So his role at the end of the Cold War is really important to reflect upon. What's also important is his mastery of diplomacy and negotiations. And when we at the Harvard Kennedy School, in our project, the American Secretaries of State project, which we conduct in conjunction with Harvard Law School, Professor Bob Mnookin, and Harvard Business School, Professor Jim Sebenius, when we spent hours talking and videotaping these interviews with Secretary Shultz in the last several years, he would return to one principal theme, that diplomacy was like a garden, and that the United States had to tend that diplomatic garden in order to be successful in the world. And he explained that when times were normal, when we were not in crisis, it was very important for the United States to go out and show respect to countries big and small in the world, to show up around the world, to create relationships of trust between American leaders and foreign leaders, so that when the crisis came, we had relationships we could call upon where people and countries could defend us and help us when times were tough for us. I've never forgotten that lesson that Secretary Shultz passed on to us. We're very grateful for the many lessons that he taught us in our Harvard negotiation project, which we're putting to use in Harvard classrooms and in a book on the Secretaries of State that Professors Mnookin, Sebenius, and I, along with our colleague, Dr. Tori Tausig, will be writing over the next several years. Finally, I want to say, what a model for all of us to think about being a lifelong learner and a lifelong advocate for the causes that you believe in passionately. When I was a fellow at Stanford, I remember marveling at 93, 94, 95-year-old George Shultz, who came to work every day at the Hoover Institution, who led seminars, who wrote books well into his mid-90s. And I especially admired him for the work he did with Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, for a world without nuclear weapons. Here were 4 people, all of whom were instrumental advocates of the United States, of our nuclear weapons power during the Cold War, concluding at the end of their careers and at the end of their lives that we should have the ambition and believe it's possible to create a world without nuclear weapons. I admired their intellectual courage. I admired the audacity of this dream of changing the world for the better. And these insights from George Shultz, I think, will stay with us for a very long time. And so we at the Future of Diplomacy Project and its American Secretary of State project within it want to honor Secretary Shultz and his lasting legacy for the United States.